On Saturday, January 3rd, 2026, the United States carried out a military operation inside Venezuela. The U.S. government says the operation captured Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia Flores in Caracas and removed them to U.S. custody. By Monday, January 5th, Maduro appeared in a U.S. federal court in New York, pleaded not guilty, and described what happened as a kidnapping. This is the sequence the world is now forced to process. Not just the capture, not just the courtroom, but the method, the language, the legal justification, and the precedent. Because a sitting head of state being seized by foreign military force is not a routine law enforcement event in modern international relations. It is a stress test for the global system, and in the days since it began, the story has moved at extraordinary speed. Operational details have emerged. Casualty details have been confirmed. Interim leadership inside Venezuela has been established. Official U.S. framing has been made public. Legal objections have been raised. Emergency debates have taken place at the United Nations, and even U.S. partners in the region have warned about the precedent. Confirmed facts are separated from claims. Official statements are distinguished from analysis. One standard is applied to everyone: international law. Because if international law is replaced by who can do it, then what happened in Caracas becomes a template available to every powerful state. What actually happened? Early Saturday, January 3rd, U.S. forces struck targets inside Venezuela, and U.S. officials say the mission ended with Maduro and Flores in custody. The operation involved extensive planning, coordination across multiple agencies, and a large military footprint. More than 150 military aircraft were involved. That number matters. This was not a single helicopter and a handful of operators. This was a large-scale, coordinated military operation with high logistical complexity and serious escalation risk. The United States presents the operation as a law enforcement mission supported by military force. The justification relies heavily on a criminal case that dates back several years. In 2020, U.S. prosecutors indicted Nicolás Maduro. The indictment alleges narco-terrorism and drug trafficking conspiracy, and U.S. officials have long claimed Maduro's inner circle facilitated trafficking networks. These allegations exist in U.S. court documents. They remain allegations. Maduro has denied them consistently. What is new is not the accusation. What is new is the enforcement method. On January 5th, Maduro appeared in court and pleaded not guilty. He said he had been captured. Now comes the moment that changed the entire meaning of the story. Trump did not describe the operation only as law enforcement. He described it as a change in control. He said the United States would run Venezuela for a period during a safe transition, and indicated U.S. oil companies would be involved in rebuilding and restarting the system. He also raised the possibility of further military action if the remaining leadership does not cooperate. Once second strike enters the conversation, this stops looking like a court-only story. It becomes coercion logic. A second strike is not a courtroom tool. It is a military leverage tool. Trump also said he was not afraid of putting boots on the ground. That phrase matters. Because once boots on the ground are mentioned, occupation dynamics enter the equation, whether the word occupation is used or not. Now the image layer. Images circulated showing Maduro restrained and blindfolded in custody, wearing casual clothing associated with a U.S. Navy ship. Those images became viral. They became psychological symbols, a sitting president presented as a detainee. At the same time, fabricated and misrepresented images also spread widely. So the correct approach is clear. Viral images are not proof of law. They are instruments of messaging. In modern conflict, perception is not a sideshow. Perception is part of the operation. Now we step back. How did we get here? This operation did not appear suddenly. It is the endpoint of a long escalation curve between Washington and Caracas. For years, Venezuela has been under heavy sanctions. For years, diplomatic trust collapsed. For years, the United States recognized Venezuela's opposition as legitimate and rejected Maduro's elections as illegitimate. For years, Maduro relied on internal security structures and international partnerships to survive sanctions pressure. The key milestone came in 2020. That was when the US indictment was issued. It reframed the relationship. Not simply political opposition, criminal targeting. But one question matters more than all others. If the indictment existed in 2020, why did military seizure happen in 2026? What changed? One answer is normalization of escalation. Another is policy drift from pressure to force. In the months leading into this crisis, the United States carried out repeated strikes on vessels it described as linked to drug trafficking from Venezuela. Those operations resulted in more than 100 deaths across dozens of actions and prompted legal scrutiny. That pattern matters. Force was being applied repeatedly. Legal justification was being stretched. Political temperature was rising. This is how a big event becomes possible. Not through one decision, through many smaller precedents that weaken restraint. In the days after the operation, Trump went beyond Venezuela. He publicly signaled openness to new military actions elsewhere in the region. That matters because it signals this is not a one-off. It signals a broader posture in which cross-border force is presented as a viable policy tool. Now we reach the backbone. International law. Under the UN Charter, the use of force in international relations is restricted. States are not permitted to use force simply because they believe they are morally right. There are narrow pathways. UN Security Council authorization, consent from the host state, self-defense against an armed attack under strict conditions. In this case, there was no Security Council authorization. There was no consent from Venezuela. The United States argues self-defense and law enforcement logic. But criminal activity such as trafficking does not automatically meet the threshold of an armed attack under international law. That is the core legal collision. A criminal indictment is not a UN mandate. It is not a cross-border arrest warrant enforced by military force. If it were, any powerful state could indict rival leaders and claim the right to seize them. That is why international law separates criminal jurisdiction from military authority. Not to protect tyrants, but to prevent global chaos. This is why precedent matters. Even if someone believes Maduro is guilty, even if someone believes Venezuela suffered under corruption, the question remains unchanged. Was this lawful under international rules? And if not, what precedent has been created? Because Russia, China, and every regional power will study this. They will study the mechanics, they will study the messaging, they will study the reaction, they will study the cost. If the cost is manageable, the method spreads. That is how the rules-based order erodes. Not through collapse, through repetition. Now the United Nations. On January 5th, the Security Council met in emergency session. Arguments were made that the operation violated Venezuelan sovereignty and set a dangerous precedent. The Secretary General expressed concern about instability and unilateral intervention. The United States defended its actions. Enforcement, however, remains unlikely. The United States holds veto power. Condemnation can be loud. Sanctioning the strongest actor is structurally difficult. That is why international law depends on restraint. When restraint disappears, the system weakens. Now one of the most important escalation vectors. The Cuban factor. On January 5th, Cuba announced that 32 of its citizens were killed during the operation. Cuba said those killed were members of its armed forces and intelligence services. 2 days of national mourning were declared. This matters, because the operation did not only strike Venezuelan sovereignty, it killed personnel from a close ally. That widens the risk map. Cuba is unlikely to respond with conventional force. Its response space is asymmetric. Intelligence activity, cyber operations, diplomatic pressure, proxy influence, long-term strategic friction. This creates a second axis of consequence beyond Caracas. Now, domestic U.S. law. International law is one test. Domestic constitutional process is another. The U.S. system includes checks on unilateral war-making. In this case, senior officials acknowledged Congress was not notified before the operation. That raises oversight questions. Even supporters of the outcome must confront the process. Unchecked executive force creates domestic precedent as well as international precedent. Now the core narrative conflict. Narco-justice or regime change. The U.S. frames this as law enforcement. A criminal regime treated like a criminal network. At the same time, the language used suggests administration and control. Running the country. Taking back oil interests. Threatening further strikes. Those phrases do not describe a courtroom-only action. They describe power management. Both narratives cannot fully coexist. If it is law enforcement, you do not run the country. If you run the country, it is not just law enforcement. That ambiguity is how rules erode. Because once force is rebranded as justice, every future intervention can be justified the same way. Now oil must be explained properly. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven crude reserves, around 300 billion barrels. Its crude is heavy. Heavy crude requires specific refinery systems. Geography matters. Shipping routes matter. Insurance matters. Contract enforceability matters. For Venezuela, oil revenue is the state's bloodstream. It pays wages. It funds imports. It sustains institutions. When sanctions restrict exports, production falls. When production falls, revenue collapses. When revenue collapses, state capacity weakens. That cycle defines Venezuelan geopolitics. So when a powerful state says it will run an oil-rich country, real questions follow. Who signs contracts? Who controls PDVSA? Who issues sanctions waivers? Who approves foreign investment? Who controls shipping clearance? Who controls revenue flows? Oil is not a side topic. Oil is the transition. That is why this is not just a political event. It is an economic governance event. Now the region, Latin America's response has been divided. But several governments issued joint warnings against unilateral military action without international authorization. These are not adversaries. These are diplomatic partners. Their warning is about vulnerability. Latin America remembers intervention. Now, inside Venezuela, the state did not collapse immediately. The Supreme Court appointed Delcy Rodriguez as interim president. She was formally sworn in on January 5th. She is a former vice president and oil minister. That matters because the political transition is directly tied to the oil apparatus. Institutions are signaling continuity. But continuity is not stability. Power vacuums can expand quietly. The first few days rarely tell the full story. The next 2 months will. Now, global power dynamics. Russia and China will not view this emotionally. They will view it as precedent. If one power can seize a leader by force and claim legality, others will ask why they cannot. This is not prediction. It is risk logic. Precedent is a weapon. Once used, it spreads. Now, allies. Some condemned. Some stayed cautious. Why? Dependence. Security ties. Trade leverage. Issue linkage. And the reality that enforcement against the United States is limited. Silence is not endorsement. It is calculation. Now, US domestic noise. Critics argue oil motives. Others argue regime change. Others argue distraction politics. These claims exist. They cannot be proven as fact. They are part of the perception war. Finally, what happens next? Scenario 1. Managed transition. Possible, difficult. Scenario 2. Internal fragmentation. Plausible. Scenario 3. Asymmetric retaliation. More credible after Cuban casualties. Scenario 4. Long-term norm erosion. Already underway. This is not about liking Maduro. This is not about defending a regime. This is about whether law still limits power. Because if indictments become invasion licenses, no leader is secure and no sovereignty is stable. International law is not perfect, but it is the firewall between order and permanent coercion. If that firewall fails, the smallest nations pay first, and eventually everyone pays. Thank you for watching. Beyond identities, beyond borders, beyond division, our destiny is one. You are watching Next Horizon Global.